Okay, happy Tuesday, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Here in East Tennessee, we're getting a little bit of sunlight every now and then, so that's kind of nice. Um, so I've been looking over this morning and this afternoon. I've been looking over your discussion questions on Julian. As always, I can't address all of them, although they're all good. And I may not be able to get to everybody, but again, I noticed some of the clusters of questions that were emerging and am trying to address some of them. Let's just start with a kind of general introduction. With a lot of the figures we've looked at this semester, I've said something about sort of the status of that thinker, that writer, ecclesial status. And in fact, Andrew asked a question about Julian's reception. So the first thing to say is that she's not Saint Julian of Norwich. She has not been canonized in the Roman Catholic Church. But that doesn't mean that she's not pretty highly revered in certain circles. In terms of her official status, she is somewhere on the spectrum between, let's say, a Meister Eckhart, who was respected but who was formally censured by the church. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, our author next week, Catherine of Siena, who is going to become one of the most highly decorated figures in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. Julian is somewhere in the middle. So the question is, why this ambivalence? Why, particularly if she was never officially reprimanded, why does she not have a higher status? And I think maybe you can begin to see some of the reasons in our reading, even though we just read a short sliver of her book, The Showings. She has a tendency to make some fairly radical or radical seeming moves in her theology that you can imagine disquieting some people. Radical inversions in some cases. And I'll give you an example. Emily very astutely noted that Julian makes a kind of strange statement at one point to the effect that Christ has become our debtor. Okay? So not that we owe a debt to Christ, but Christ has become our debtor, which is kind of putting Anselm on his head. And indeed, elsewhere in the showing, so this was not in our reading, but elsewhere, she actually says, she uses the language of satisfaction, which of course we're very familiar with from Anselm, but says that Christ sort of makes satisfaction to us, not that we need to make satisfaction to God. And talks about sort of the surplus of God's love poured out on the cross as intended to satisfy us and restore us to bliss. There's a point at which Jesus asked her, "Are you fully satisfied that I suffered for you?" And the soul answers yes, to which Jesus then says, "If you are fully satisfied, I am fully satisfied. It is a joy, a bliss, an endless pleasure to me that ever I suffered the passion for you." So, again, nothing sort of out and out heretical about that, but does seem to be turning certain ideas upside down in a way that some people surely did not appreciate. So, but the ambivalence of her reception should not obscure her importance, both historical and theological importance. I mean, she's important historically because she is the very first female writer in the English language that we know of. So that is a pretty big deal. But it's not just the brute fact that she was the first female writer, it's that writers up to the present day, writers in the English language, have found her to be a tremendous inspiration. This is certainly true of theologians, and in some ways, I mean, we're living through a period in which I think Julian is being appreciated by theologians as a theologian perhaps more than ever before. But Julian has also been appreciated by a number of poets, including people like T.S. Eliot, who used lines from the showings and wove them into his poetry. Now, all this raises the question, how did she become such a theologically sophisticated author? And one might also say, where does she get her literary sophistication? Mandy asked a question about some of the language that she used that has a kind of Neoplatonic ring to it. How would she have been exposed to those ideas? We just have no idea. We really don't know. We don't know anything about her background. We can't even be sure that she could read Latin. So I'm sorry, but several of you asked about her influences. Did Dennis influence her? Did Bernard? It's just impossible to know because she does not name names and we know nothing about her background. Yes, obviously she received some kind of education, an education that introduced her to sophisticated ideas, but we can't really go beyond that in any way. In any event, with Julian, we are dealing not just with a true theologian, but with an original theologian. Now, superficially, in some ways, she fits the kind of profile that one would expect for a writer of her time period, the late Middle Ages, and a writing of her sex. The Showings is, in some ways, visionary literature. She was writing about visions she received. All of those visions related in some way to the crucified Christ, and that was pretty typical of the late Middle Ages. Lots of visionary literature, lots of meditation on the crucified Christ. But unlike many of her peers, she did not focus on the sufferings of Christ in order to arouse certain emotions for sort of devotional reasons, but rather she reflected on the sufferings of Christ in order to gain insight into the nature of God, in order to gain a kind of knowledge. So the showings themselves, the revelations themselves, the visions are not the main attraction. They are rather the springboards for a very sort of deep and sophisticated theological reflection. Another one of Mandy's questions is well put. Mandy asked whether perhaps Julian is akin to the Cloud author and to Meister Eckhart in sort of reacting against some of the excesses of what we might call passion piety in the late Middle Ages. And I think maybe in some subtle ways that is true. For her, the cross is at the center of everything, but his purpose is not, again, simply to induce a certain kind of emotional response, but to lead us deeper into the mystery of God. Okay, so I want to focus on a couple of major points around which several of your questions clustered. These are all points that made her a somewhat edgy theologian, both in the 14th century and today. The first point has to do with the goodness of nature. She's very emphatic about the goodness of nature, and so emphatic that several of you, Ellie and Kirk at the very least, asked whether she really believed that humans have a sinful nature at all. I think it's possible to kind of get the impression that for her, human nature is basically unwounded by sin, which prompted Kirk's question, which is Julian a Pelagian? You can always count on Kirk not to beat around the bush, but to get right to the heresy. Is this lady a Pelagian? That is an understandable question. I do want to be clear, however, that I don't think there are only two choices in front of us. I don't think we have to say, okay, well, either she's basically Augustinian in her anthropology or she is basically Pelagian. It is certainly true that she is not Augustinian. Now, she may be Augustinian in some ways, but in terms of her understanding of the fall and its impact on human nature, no, she is not an Augustinian. That does not necessarily, however, mean that she must then be a Pelagian. Now, there is indeed for Julian something in human nature that survives the fall. And that would seem to be what she calls the godly will. She mentions this a time or two in our reading, in our anthology. Now, this doesn't mean that Adam and Eve sort of escaped the fall unscathed. For her, Adam seems to be injured, particularly in his sort of power and his understanding, his intelligence, but not in his godly will. Now, again, does that make her a Pelagian? I don't think so. I mean, for one thing, she takes sin very, very seriously. In our reading, she says that sin is worse than hell. Okay? So sin is not something we can just sort of brush off. Moreover, sin is not something to be treated lightly because sin actually plays a kind of positive role in salvation history. You know, for Pelagius, sin is simply a problem to be overcome, and we can overcome it. That's not true for Julian. And this brings us to an idea, a concept that Colby asked about, and that I think is really important for understanding Julian. It's the notion of a felix culpa. That's a Latin phrase, F-E-L-I-X space C-U-L-P-A. This could be translated as fortunate fall. It could be translated as a happy sin. Okay. Now, this is not a brand new idea. This is not something that Julian just sort of came up with and no one ever thought about it before. But she develops the idea of the felix culpa in interesting ways. Basically, the felix culpa is the idea that sin, though, of course, something bad and evil in itself, sin actually ultimately will bring about a state of affairs that is greater and happier than the original state of affairs. Okay, so in other words, if you believe in the felix culpa, you believe that for human beings, at least saved human beings, will ultimately be even happier than Adam was and Eve were back in the garden. Okay, so sin may be something to be lamented and bemoaned, but the good that comes out of sin ultimately outweighs and overshadows the negative. That's the basic idea of the felix culpa. And we see this in a couple of ways in our reading. So for Julian, the fall is not so much this horrible, unthinkable catastrophe as it is an opportunity for God to demonstrate his goodness to us. So we have a better understanding now of God's goodness, and we're also humbled by this. We begin to realize our absolute dependence on God's love. So it has this kind of humbling effect. But ultimately, sin amplifies our happiness. This is the felix part. Sin amplifies our happiness because of the response from God that it elicits. And here's a line, this is from page 237. This kind of bliss we never could have had and known unless that property of goodness which is in God had been opposed through sin, through which we have this bliss. Okay? So we would have never really known the full extent of the goodness of God had not sin sort of drawn the goodness of God out into the open, right? Because God's goodness necessarily opposes sin. So yet again, um, the fall is not in every way a good thing, of course. Sin is always sin. But Julian wants to put the emphasis on the ultimate good that comes out of sin. Now, Patrick raised an interesting question about some statements that Julian made that sort of suggest that no one really loves sin and that sort of thing, which seems to be just a kind of empirically false notion on the face of it. She certainly does believe that people have sinned, do sin, will continue to sin, at least to a certain point. And again, perhaps you could chalk that up to the impaired understanding that sin sort of has brought about in us. But I think she would say that even when we sin, the godly will, which still remains in us in some way, never really consents to sin. So I think that's how she would deal with that particular issue. Okay, two more main issues to address. The first is universalism. Okay, universalism is the belief that in the end, at the very least, all human beings, and maybe even all rational creatures, so that would include angels, will be saved. That's universalism. The question, which is always raised whenever Julian is read, is Julian a universalist? The answer, I think, is no, if what we mean by universalism is a dogmatic assertion that no one will be damned and all will be saved. Because Julian never explicitly denies the existence of hell, and she never sort of forthrightly and absolutely asserts that all human beings will be saved in the end. Okay. That said, there is certainly a kind of universalist logic in her writings, and you could make the case that that logic sort of necessitates that she was a universalist, whether or not she wanted to sort of come out as one. And again, we already see a little bit of this in our reading today. Again, the cross is at the center of her theology. What is it that the cross reveals? Well, among other things, but perhaps above all for Julian, the cross reveals the infinity and the invincibility of God's love. There is nothing more powerful than God's love. There is no human no that is more powerful than God's yes to us. So she says on page 241, "For enduring and marvelous is that love, which cannot and will not be broken because of offenses," or we could say because of sins. Okay. Elsewhere on page 244, she says that God will never desist from working on us, quote, "until all his beloved children are born and brought to birth." And this bringing to birth is new creation, new birth, regeneration, redemption. And then the very end of our reading, this is one of those famous lines that T.S. Eliot used in his poetry. She says, "All will be well, and you will see it yourself that every kind of thing will be well." And that is often interpreted as a kind of statement of how of the universal restoration of all creation. Yes, sin has introduced disorder and ugliness into God's creation, but God's creation will eventually be restored fully and completely. Okay, so is Julian a universalist? Again, it's one of those yes and no things. No, in the sense that she does not claim as a matter of certain knowledge that all will be saved. But yes, in the sense that universalism seems to be a kind of logical corollary of some of the other claims that she makes in this writing. Okay, that brings us to the third main topic that I wanted to cover, which of course is treated extensively in our reading, and that is the femininity or maternity of God. This always startles people when they read Julian. It prompted a question from Kirk, is this a kind of common trope? I mean, to what extent would audiences at this time have come across this kind of idea? Good question. I think that it might not quite be right to say that this was a common trope, but certainly previous authors had discussed sort of maternal aspects of God, and not just fringy authors, but very sort of mainstream Christian authors. So Augustine, Anselm, Cistercian writers like Bernard, none of them were averse to sometimes comparing God to a mother or something like that. And of course, going even further back, there are biblical precedents for this as well. It's there in the Old Testament. Andrew mentioned the feminine personification of wisdom in Proverbs, which Julian seems to be drawing from here. But there's also texts like Isaiah 66:13, where God speaks and says, like a son comforted by his mother, will I comfort you. Jesus in Matthew 23, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I have longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her brood under her wing. So comparing himself to a mother hen. So this is not something altogether shocking and unprecedented to compare God to a mother. What is unusual is the amount of time that Julian devotes to this theme and the way that she develops this theme. So let me tackle a few of the questions you guys had about the way she handles these images. Andrea asked a question about the extent to which, for Julian, it is the Son specifically who is mother, and the extent to which it is the whole Trinity who is mother. Well, this is another one of those on the one hand, on the other hand kinds of things. On the one hand, it is true that Julian most closely sort of associates maternal characteristics with the Son, especially in light of the incarnation, which is this kind of merciful act, and in light of the cross, which she sees as the kind of matrix of our new birth. We are sort of born again on the cross. So Christ becomes our mother on the cross. So there are some ways that are unique to the Son that God exemplifies this sort of maternal love. However, and you can see this at the bottom of page 235, for instance, numerous times she calls the whole Trinity mother. And if you want to sort of understand how she can go back and forth like that, I think you have to keep in mind that she's got a pretty sophisticated grasp of Trinitarian theology. And it was good Trinitarian theology by this time to believe that no person of the Trinity acts without the cooperation of the other two persons of the Trinity. So another way of saying that is that anything that the Son does, the Father and the Spirit do too, although their precise roles in that same action may differ. Okay? But going even beyond that, Christ is our mother, not just due to the incarnation and then the cross, but also because Christ is our creator. And creation itself is a Trinitarian act. Okay? It's not as if it's just the Father who's creating while the Son and Spirit sit on the sidelines. Okay? So it is both appropriate to particularly emphasize the maternal qualities of the Son, while also emphasizing that the entire Trinitarian God exemplifies those very qualities. Now, Mandy asked, how unique was this focus on the Trinity? Because in some ways, she is sort of doing more with Trinitarian theology than a number of authors that we've read. I would say that the focus on the Trinity itself is not particularly unique, but certainly this idea of the Trinity specifically, not just sort of God, in a generic sense, but the Trinity specifically as mother, that is an idea that, to my knowledge, is pretty original to Julian. Now, Anne asked, I thought, a very perceptive question, which is, why all this emphasis on maternal love? And does not this emphasis on maternal love seem to imply or suggest that a mother's love is somehow more significant than the love of a father, or greater than paternal love? And which raises kind of a bigger question, which is, is part of what Julian is trying to do is to downplay the fatherhood of God. Does she want to emphasize the motherhood of God at the expense of the fatherhood of God? I think the answer is no. Note that she does early in our reading. By the way, the showings is several hundred pages, so we really are just reading a fraction. But even in our reading on page 235, she uses some nuptial imagery that's very familiar to us from Bernard or Mechtild. And in this nuptial imagery, even in Julian, the soul is the bride and therefore feminine, and God is the bridegroom and therefore masculine. Okay, so there's that. On the very same page 235, and I think she does this later too, in the very same sentence, she says that the Son is our mother and brother. Okay, so masculine and feminine. And then there are other times where she calls Jesus mother, but continues to use the masculine pronoun. So Jesus, our mother, he does this. Now, I think she's well aware of what she's doing. I don't think this is some sort of thoughtlessness on her part. So I think for her, it's a question of balance. She doesn't want the image of God as mother to eclipse the image of God as father. Both images are important. Both images do a certain kind of work. Both images are equally metaphorical and equally true. Look at what she says on page 237, and she repeats this very phrase at least twice. This is the second paragraph on 237. As truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our mother. Now, of course, that's a reversible statement, right? You could say, so truly is God our mother, or as truly as God is our mother, so truly is God our Father, right? It's reversible. However, why does she put it that way? She puts it the way that she does because I think she's trying to offer a correction to what she perceives to be an imbalance in the Christian tradition. And of course, that imbalance is an almost exclusive focus on the fatherhood of God, the maleness, masculinity of God, to the almost total marginalization of the maternal and feminine qualities of God. Okay, so she's not trying to talk about God in exclusively masculine and she's not trying to talk about God in exclusively feminine and maternal terms. She continues to use language of father and fatherhood, but she's trying to bring more balance. And of course, by using both images, by calling God father and mother in the same sentence, by calling Jesus mother and using the masculine pronoun in the same sentence, she's also up to something else. And that is she is underlining the metaphorical and hence limited nature of these names, right? If you use Father exclusively as a name for God, you might well be liable to forget that you are using a metaphor. You might be in danger of literalizing that name. But of course, if you call God a father and a mother, it is immediately obvious that these are not names meant to be taken in any kind of literal sense. And so this brings me to sort of the last point. It's still under the heading of the motherhood of God, and that is the apophatic temperature of this particular writing. It was very interesting. One of you sort of asked a question about a parallel between Julian and Dennis. That was Emily. And Caleb asked a question, basically wondering if what we have here in Julian is sort of the opposite of Dennis. And I tend to think that even though in terms of style, in terms of tone, they're very different, I think in terms of substance, Dennis and Julian are close in some ways. I mean, Dennis himself, we didn't necessarily see this so much in our reading, but in other writings, Dennis saw the value in exuberant sort of cataphatic language, right? The Bible uses all kinds of language to describe God, including, calling God a drunkard, okay? And, we should use that language. And in fact, in some ways, the more outlandish the name or metaphor for God, the better. Because with those outlandish kinds of names, it's very clear that the names are not to be taken literally, right? I mean, no one literally is going to think that God is a drunkard. And I think Julian's point is along the same lines. Look, if you can call God a rock, why can you not call God a mother, right? These are both metaphors that are obviously untrue literally, yet which communicate a very profound truth about God if understood properly. Okay? And so, it is true that we don't necessarily see the apophatic side of Julian real clearly in this text. I think it's there implicitly, precisely in the way that she tries to balance maternal and paternal and feminine and masculine imagery in relation to God. Precisely by doing that, we are reminded of the metaphorical, of the non-literal nature of those names, and therefore of the failure of our language and our names for God to adequately capture the full reality of the mystery of God. Right, I think I'll end there.